what I wanted to do really, instead of talking about the nitty-gritty of this particular tax system, is to start at least by stepping back and providing some rather broader comments on the objectives of the overall exercise, and then a little bit about the specifics. So as I see it, and as has been discussed earlier today, there's been sort of two big drivers for the recent push for reforms. One has been what's culminated in the whole BEPS process, which is, a set of economic and political concerns over the ability of governments to raise revenue by taxing corporate incomes, and, importantly, I think, to implement tax policies that favor their own firms worldwide and attract capital, so different forms of tax competition. So that's been, one driver. The other driver, which was alluded to earlier, has been widespread political discontent, both in the form of protests on the street in the UK against Starbucks, Facebook, and Amazon, and really widespread media campaigns in the US and the UK outing various forms of egregious tax avoidance behavior. And much of the perceived concern and pressure for reforms from the public in particular has been around this lack of fairness in the tax system. And that's one of the things I want to talk a little bit about, which was some questions came up earlier and I wanted to come back to. And I think there's interesting analogies with the other exciting policy events that are going on today around the Brexit debate, which were, again, made by earlier speakers. There's undoubtedly really important underlying fundamental issues here that economists and lawyers have a lot to say about what the tax system wants to and can achieve. And I think Mike in particular laid those out very nicely this morning. But I also think that, similar to the Brexit debate, the public discourse has been fairly devoid of facts and figures, and in part experts like us have been able, and I'm pointing to myself here, have been unable to answer some of the key questions that the population has really challenged us with about what fairness is and what we're trying to achieve with the tax system. And so the debate has been reasonably uninformed. So in this sense, I really want to applaud Mike and his colleagues at the CBT here for not only trying to push forward the sort of intellectual frontier about our understanding about the functioning of tax, but also about trying to communicate it to the public. And I guess some of my comments are going to be about trying to push them and others to do that more. The issue of international taxation of corporate income was one that was really ducked by the Merleys Review. So the Merleys Review is a big review undertaken at the IFS some 5 to 6 years ago, which initially set out to think about a coherent structure for the entire tax system, including the international taxation of corporate income. But it really quickly became apparent that international taxation of corporate income was way too difficult, and it was just dropped. So, it's great that Mike and his colleagues have picked that up, and I think that's to be applauded. So, specifically on the destination base and the cash flow tax, I think it's really clear that in what Mike has both presented and in the draft I saw, it's very clearly explained what the benefits of that are and what the potential issues are. So that moving to a cash flow basis of taxation has much to recommend it. That's been well articulated in the literature, in particular by Mike. It moves to treating equity and debt equally. It moves to a much simpler implementation and many other sort of attractive properties. The destination base has an interesting idea, and I think it's very carefully thought through and well articulated in what they say. So, as I said, what I wanted to do is to raise what I think are two particularly kind of more fundamental issues that I think the group has perhaps focused a little bit less on. So one of which is fairness, and the other of which is the incentive effects with respect to innovation and sort of more fundamental change in industries. So on fairness, I think there's been two different types of fairness that have been talked about and that people are concerned about. One that economists and lawyers tend to talk more about is kind of which country has the right to tax different bits of capital income. And I think intelligent people can disagree about this, though I think most economists don't really see that as a potentially sensible basis for structuring the tax system, particularly in a world of intangible assets where I just don't see how one can meaningfully say where they're located in the world. And I think, as Mike put it, if this is really the basis on which we're trying to tax corporate income, then we want to think about user fees or some other way of thinking about it. I think if we look at the public debate, the ideas of fairness are really much more around the equity aspects and the ability for the tax system to be redistributive. And if wealthy individuals are able to avoid tax, and so countries are not able to achieve the amount of redistribution that they desire, then it's, that's an important issue, and we need to think about how we can design tax systems that enable us to achieve that level of redistribution if we can. And it's not just disenfranchised protesters that are worrying about this. There are sensible economists around the world who are thinking about this and about the fairness aspects of income, of taxes. So I think the important thing here to think about is that fairness is a property of a tax system and not a specific tax. And this is where, again, I'd like to a bit challenge Mike and his colleagues to one of the things I think that the Murley's review did get right was to think about the tax system as a whole, not just individual taxes. And so I think thinking about the fairness and equity redistribution that corporate income taxes can achieve in isolation makes no sense at all. If we're able to achieve as much redistribution as we want with other aspects of the tax and benefit system, then we can do whatever we want with the corporate income tax system as long as it doesn't undermine that. And so there's no, we don't care that the corporate tax system in itself achieves a particular level of redistribution. That's something that we want the system to have. And so if we have a good understanding of that, then it's incumbent on us to communicate that better. We probably don't have a good understanding of that. The question was raised earlier that, economists will be distraught to hear that the political debate is more around equity than efficiency. But I think there are many economists thinking about those issues, and perhaps it's important that we put those a bit more together with thinking about the actual structure of corporate income tax systems. I worry that we're kind of at risk of being seen as irrelevant in the political debate if we don't engage with that issue. And it's a bit unfortunate Margaret Hodge isn't here because I know that's sort of her real, that's one of the things that's driving her thinking. So I think among politicians that is very influential. So I completely agree with Mike's comments earlier this morning that it's not immediately obvious that corporate income taxes are a key part of the tax system that we want to use to achieve this level of redistribution. But I think we are perhaps ducking the issue a little bit if we then just dismiss it and stop talking about it altogether. So, addressing questions like what amount of redistribution are we currently achieving, and what role do corporate income tax systems or particular proposals for reform play in that? Do they undermine, who bears the incidence of this, and do corporate income taxes play an important role as a backstop to our ability to collect other income taxes? So, as Mike presented this particular tax, the destination-based cash flow tax, it seems reasonably progressive in that it's a tax on domestic shareholders' non-labor consumption income, basically. And it would be nice to know more about this and more about how this fit in to our a broader picture of the redistribution that a tax system achieves. And coming back again to another question that was asked earlier, we do know that moving towards more consumption-based taxes undermines our ability to use the tax system to achieve redistributive aims. And so, as Mike said, that seems to be where we're going. And if that's true, is that where we want to be headed? And this isn't, as was said earlier, just because the incidence of corporate income taxes are more on shareholders and consumption taxes are on consumers. It's because with a consumption tax, we don't have the ability to have a nonlinear tax schedule, and so tends to tax higher income people higher because we tax chunks of income, chunks of consumption, rather than income as a whole. And so I think it would be interesting to think about how these proposals for tax reform fit into that overall picture. I think particularly given that this is meant to be the sort of more ambitious reform. So the question is whether existing income and other taxes allow us to achieve the level of redistribution that we want, and how these potential reforms fit into that. So the second comment I wanted to make was on a completely different topic, on efficiency. And so the efficiency aspects of the cash flow tax, which have really been emphasized in both the draft chapter and Mike's presentation. And so the proposal as outlined, leads to improvements in the efficiency aspects of the corporate tax, of the corporate income tax system, by removing a number of non-neutralities. So most importantly, between debt and equity, and over location of particular activities. And those are clearly very important, and that's clearly going to, be an improvement on the current tax system. But one aspect that I thought got a bit less attention is the potential incentive effects that taxes on what are called economic rents might have on driving innovation and dynamic efficiency. So a lot of the focus has been on more static efficiency issues about, what's happening in the market today, but less on thinking about investment in innovations that really change the nature of the industry and perhaps lead to much bigger welfare gains than the static kind of efficiency things that we normally think about. And it's really not at all clear that what are referred to as economic rents in the cash flow sense might not, at least in part, be returns on entrepreneurial investment, particularly given that we know a lot of the companies and a lot of the types of investment that are involved here are in intangible assets. So intangible assets aren't all assets, as we heard earlier, aren't all investments into innovation, but some important parts of them are. And I think, ideally, as Mike said, we'd like to be able to distinguish these location-specific economic rents from the ones that are more potentially innovative, but that's pretty hard to do. And so it would at least be interesting to think about what are the distorting effects left there. So, ironically, to tie that back to my earlier comment about the equity concerns, we know relatively little about the overall effects of corporate income taxes on growth, nor do we know about the effects of innovation on growth and inequality. And there are really plausible reasons to believe that innovation is an important determinant of social mobility. And so it could actually be that, in this sense, low corporate income taxes encourage, or at least don't discourage, innovation that might in fact achieve more redistribution in the long run than the redistributive effects that we think about through the more traditional aspects of redistribution I was talking about in my first point. And so, those two things I'm talking about speak really, they work against each other, and they're things I think we know relatively little about. So these comments are perhaps a little bit unfair in focusing on aspects that are outside the scope of the problem that the group set themselves. So I think they correctly, very ambitiously set out to think about what the best tax system we could think of was. And I would like to challenge them a little bit to think maybe to go back to the Murley's review idea and to think that we really need to look at these types of reforms in the tax system as a whole and think about whether they really are achieving what we ultimately want to achieve with the tax system, and kind of leads us back to why do we have a corporate tax system at all? What are we actually trying to do with this? As Mike said, are we trying to extract a user charge on corporations who are using public resources? Are we trying to redistribute income from wealthy individuals to poor individuals? Companies don't pay tax, people do. And so what people is it that we're trying to reach underneath this corporate income tax? And if we think about it in that way, can we perhaps think of some more fundamental type reforms? So besides that, I want to just, again, applaud the group for their efforts in, I think, making real advances in both asking and answering questions about what a corporate income tax system in itself might look like in the 21st century. But I do think that they could think a little bit more carefully about the equity efficiency trade-off that we face and how we can understand that in the context of the entire tax system, not just the corporate income tax system. Thanks.